Okay, welcome everyone. I hope everyone's okay, surviving the pandemic so far. If you're here, you have survived, that's good. And also the mini lockdown part two, which is fortunately not as severe as the first lockdown earlier in March. But still, I think everyone would agree these are pretty strange times, but we've gotten good at doing these kind of online meetings, which might be something we do more of in the future. So today's session, which is the return of the Interdisciplinary Research Forum, which has had a little break for a while, it's on vaccines and how the anti-vaccine movement is undermining these wonderful interventions for infectious disease. And it's really quite topical at the moment because we're hearing currently a lot about how a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, it might be our only way out of this pandemic. And we're hearing also some negative noise coming from the anti-vaccine people and conspiracy theories, etc. So I'd like to start off today's session just by telling you a little bit about the lineup. We've got experts in different areas of research, vaccines, development, infectious diseases, particularly viruses, immunology, and public health, including vaccine uptake dynamics in populations. And of course, everyone that's here is free to contribute. We welcome questions and discussions along the way, and the floor is open to anyone in the second half after the three presentations. If you do have questions earlier on, you can type them into the chat, and we'll try and get to them as soon as we can. Right. So some of you should remember a time when measles was a huge global problem. My life kind of has coincided with the measles vaccine, and I remember getting it as a kid, the vaccine that is. And we used to have 500,000 notifications per year. So measles is a notifiable disease. Cases must be reported to the authorities. And that was 500,000 until about the 1970s when a vaccine was introduced. Vaccine uptake then reached about 90% of the population in the 90s before declining slightly. And that coincides with an almost complete loss of measles cases and notifications shown in that green line there. So that's a huge success of vaccines. Measles is a very, very infectious virus. A single case can easily cause outbreaks, and it's transmitted by the airborne route, similarly to SARS-CoV-2. Why it can spread very easily. So some facts about measles in children: 1 in 1,000 infected children develop encephalitis that can lead to quite severe convulsions, deafness, intellectual disabilities. 1 in 4 of those will be hospitalized. 1 or 2 in 1,000 will die from respiratory or neurological complications as well. And COVID-19 is a log lower than that for deaths, and this hasn't been a lockdown for measles. I think there's a number of reasons why the UK lost its measles-free status in 2019. It's a complex picture, but quite simply, the notifications got too high despite it being a vaccine-preventable disease. So how did this happen? So as I mentioned, it's complex, but one potential reason is that Andrew Wakefield, a British doctor, published a now retracted and false study in The Lancet in 1998 that linked the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine to development of autism in children. It's not just the Wakefield paper, however. This paper fired up the anti-vaccine movement, which was aided by social media platforms that were developed somewhat later. There's Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Here, misinformation could be easily shared without checks. In fact, these parts of the internet are not regulated fully, and mistruths and lies can very easily spread. And once digested and spread onwards, and it's almost like a viral spread, the wrong information can become almost like truth. So the Wakefield paper itself was retracted in 2010. The editor of The Lancet, Richard Horton, admitted the paper had been utterly false. Those were his words. Said The Lancet had been deceived, and his hands, he argues, were tied. Was he sorry for publishing the paper in the first place? His quote, and it's there, "I said years ago that I was sorry for the adverse effects of publishing the study." So that's an extreme example of how the negative spread of information can affect the use of vaccines in populations and can allow the resurgence of a vaccine-preventable disease. So currently, what vaccines do we actually have? There are 26 vaccines. So this slide just shows the various types of infectious disease vaccines that are available. Not all are required in each country. For example, yellow fever and malaria, and not all are given to children routinely. For example, varicella and hepatitis. It's well known there are many, many more infectious diseases than 26. And there's one important vaccine missing from this slide, and that is because it's not needed anymore, and that is smallpox. It's been eradicated. So the point to take away from this is that mostly these are significant diseases. They're largely vaccine preventable, and they could be eradicated if vaccine uptake was 100% in populations. And I think we'll probably hear a little later on that achieving that level of vaccine is very, very difficult for lots of reasons. But also we must remember that pathogens can evolve and also emerge. We're seeing that right now. So vaccines need updating like we do each year for influenza. So basically we've done a lot of the easy ones, and now the harder ones are taking a bit more time and huge expense and effort. Now, I took these 8 points about vaccines from the WHO website. They display some features that argue that vaccines are the most effective health intervention ever developed. And again, even smallpox eradication is not mentioned here. So point number one, they save lots of lives per year, plus countless infections. Point number two, that's about 100 million children globally that receive DTP, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine. We're working on more and more research and development of vaccines, and you only got to see what's going on with SARS-CoV-2 currently to understand that. We've almost controlled and nearly eliminated meningitis A from Africa. Global measles mortality has declined by 73% in the last 20 years. We've adopted the HPV or human papillomavirus vaccine into 90 countries since it was approved in 2006. There are only 3 countries left for eradication of polio. Those are Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria. And vaccines also can help limit the spread of antibiotic resistance, which we know is of huge concern for bacteria, especially Mycobacterium. And another point, perhaps Einstein is true with that particular quote, unfortunately so. So just for those non-biologists or people that don't fully appreciate exactly what vaccines are, I'm sure that everyone is aware of some vaccine features and what vaccines aim to achieve, maybe even some of the molecular and immunological details. But safety is number one. Vaccines must be safe. They're never going to compromise on that. They go through massive amounts of testing to reach that point. We're hearing a lot about this now with the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development as well. The main thing they've got to provide is sterilizing immunity. That means stopping pathogen transmission between hosts. So it's not just disease and symptoms. Also, what's very important is immunological memory. Your immune system must be stimulated and remember that infection. And clearly for large-scale rollout of vaccines, cost is an issue, simplicity of storage and being given to people. We've got to think about geography here and remote areas, and how you can get vaccines to the people that really need it. And I think we're going to hear more about this from Matt shortly. So just I'd like to go through a few examples now of vaccines, effectiveness and safety. And I've chosen a few examples to span not only time from a couple of hundred years ago to the present, but also different formats or types of vaccine, inactivated versus live vaccines, and also the Jennerian approach. And also a little bit where there's some conspiracy theories or negative sentiments have developed as well. So again, just for the non-biologists or those that are not fully familiar with different viral vaccine platforms, the simplest and oldest way to make a vaccine for a virus is to inactivate or kill the virus with chemical treatments. This can limit their effectiveness, it can limit the type of immunity that's generated, and it tends to favor antibody responses over a cellular kind of immunity. Another approach is just to weaken the virus. This is usually done genetically, and so that it does not cause the disease, but it mimics the infection in a much more limited way. These vaccines tend to be better at inducing T-cell responses. A more modern approach, though, is to take a much more simple fragment of the virus, an inert subunit of the virus. And these are really gaining momentum in more recent years. You can take a non-infectious fragment or make a virus-like particle that's not infectious at all, has no genetic component, but it stimulates good level of immunity. It's a bit like a bacterial toxin. And even newer are the genetic vaccines, the experimental vaccines that none are actually licensed yet for mass use in humans, but they're being explored and developed, particularly could be the winners for SARS-CoV-2. So this is the first example. I just want to illustrate how important a disease smallpox was. It was brought to the Americas by Europeans, and it's nicely summed up in this book that I recommend everyone reads. It's a great read, Guns, Germs and Steel. And it argues there that the fates of human societies rested partially on infectious diseases. So the story goes 90% of the South American population were thought to have been eliminated by smallpox brought from Europe. Stories of this repeated itself a couple of hundred years later in North America, where 30% of the Native Americans were actually killed by smallpox. And this indeed is one of the first examples of successful vaccination. As early as 1700, a procedure known as variolation was performed. The virus that causes smallpox is called variola major. So that was a process whereby you could withdraw pus from these pustules from someone infected with smallpox and then scrape them onto the skin of a recipient. It's called variolation, and it would induce somewhat similar disease. And Timoni started this off by variolating condemned prisoners. You can't do these kind of experiments ethically anymore, and if they survived, they got their freedom. So first examples of immunization. It became very popular, this process, with the British Royals, where a 2 to 3% death rate was considered far better than a 30% death rate from infection. It was also noticed by George Washington, who had his soldiers in America variolated to reduce smallpox infections that were going through his military camps. Then there was the work of Jenner using cowpox. He noticed that women milking cows did not get smallpox, and was immunizing people with that variant of the virus. This caused great controversy. The work was not backed by the Royal Society at the time. And then much later, when the WHO was formed after World War II, a mass vaccination program began to eradicate smallpox, and that required large numbers of doses of the vaccine to be manufactured. So manufacturing processes improved, and in 1966, the WHO granted the huge sum of $2.5 million, which seems like very little now, and this was for the global eradication of smallpox. And really, not long after great success, it was announced in 1980, a global triumph for vaccination where the disease was eradicated. But it was not without controversy. There was a publication that appeared in The Lancet in around 1903 that describes the formation of the National Anti-Vaccination League in London in 1866. And this was a big movement that was rebelling against a compulsory vaccination for smallpox. This is long before the WHO global eradication plan. And that cartoon there shows Jenner, who was the pioneer of smallpox vaccination, seeing off these anti-vaccine people. But I think vaccination really did have the last laugh here as smallpox was formally eradicated in 1980. Another example is poliomyelitis. That's actually the first human disease proved to be caused by a virus. Remember, you couldn't actually see viruses until the 1930s when electron microscopy was invented. Although scientists knew that there were filterable, transmissible agents smaller than bacteria at that point, they just didn't know what it was, so it was called a virus. And there's also anecdotal evidence that poliomyelitis is a very old disease from the writings of the Egyptians and the Romans as well. But really only epidemics were noted in the 20th century. Vaccines were attempted as early as the 1930s. They failed, but the breakthrough on this was the ability to grow polio virus in the lab. Remember, to grow virus, to make quantities of virus, you need host cells to do it. And the pioneers of this technology won the Nobel Prize in 1954. Now, the Salk vaccine used HeLa cells, well-known cell line used in labs still to this day to grow the virus, and Sabin used monkey cells to attenuate the virus. But there were a lot of concerns around this time about how safe these vaccines were. And here's a quote from Salk himself that claims that you can't get much better than safe. So these vaccines were considered very safe for the time. So measles is another example of a disease that is returning, and how different vaccine approaches have been pioneered and developed in response to mass outbreaks. It has no treatment or cure, but most people who do catch it survive the infection. But the majority of people do feel extremely sick for about a week, and up to 30% will suffer some sort of complication of the disease, ranging from diarrhea, ear infections, or pneumonia to seizures or hearing loss as a result of swelling in the brain. So it's a significant disease. So several attempts at vaccines, inactivated vaccines failed due to denaturing protective epitopes of the virus. And there were, in fact, some cases of enhanced disease after native exposure to the virus. And that's similar to that seen with another respiratory virus called RSV, which is from the same group of viruses. The attenuated vaccines worked much better, particularly when given after breastfeeding stops, because the maternal antibodies transmitted to the baby, the neonate, can neutralize the vaccine. And then later, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the controversial 3-virus mixture, which was developed in the 1970s and finally used in the UK in the 1980s. And it seems these were combined together into one shot for simplicity of administration and therefore requiring less doses. In 2005, a 4th virus, varicella, the chickenpox virus was introduced into that, but only in the United States. So I showed earlier that measles again was on the rise, and that might be due to anti-vaccine sentiments, with parents becoming reluctant to vaccinate their children. This is occurring all over the world, but it's really quite bad in 3 countries, Madagascar, Ukraine, and also in India. 2019 was a really bad year for measles. There were large increase in notifications, 200,000 deaths, and many Pacific Island countries experienced severe outbreaks. And if you've got severe outbreaks in South Pacific Islands, which are very isolated, you know you've got a major problem on your hands. And there are, in fact, a high proportion of deaths in Samoa. 1.3% of people infected died. In the UK, vaccine coverage has reduced to levels where herd immunity is not achieved, and the outbreaks are continuing to occur. So why is this happening? Why is a vaccine preventable disease on the rise again? Well, the Royal Society of Public Health has warned that social media was a breeding ground for misleading information and negative messaging surrounding vaccination, and called for an online crackdown of the fake news that is propelling these myths. I'm not really on social media, so I don't see many of these things, but I did a bit of a search and found 3 that I found were particularly interesting. This is terrible misinformation that can spread around, and many people don't understand if this is true or not. I'm sure there are many, many more examples. These are just 3 extreme ones. The first one there is the 1918 influenza pandemic was caused by vaccines. Well, that cannot be possibly true, because influenza vaccines didn't even exist in 1918. The middle one there is showing Bill Gates, what is he, the 2nd or 3rd richest man in the world, who's donating a lot of his fortune to infectious disease vaccine research. He's in fact manipulating people with chip implants in the guise of vaccines. Well, clearly that can't happen. And more recently, the messenger RNA, this experimental genetic vaccine for COVID-19, that post there is stating, well, I'm not even going to repeat it because it's just simply and totally wrong. So just a few examples of how misinformation can spread. And this is an interesting article that came out in The Economist, trying to understand why this information could spread and why people might believe it. And it's worried that these anti-vaccine conspiracy theories could hurt COVID-19 vaccine uptake, which many regard as the only way out of the current pandemic. Richer countries have a higher proportion of people who trust science and doctors, but surprisingly, those same countries tend to trust vaccines less. So there appears to be a real growing problem in the hands of these richer countries. If we look now what's happening currently with the SARS coronavirus 2 vaccines, we know there are many of them in phase 3 clinical trials. We've heard in the last week or 2 some very promising results of really great efficacy and protection from infection and transmission of the virus. But all of these are largely experimental platforms, and the speed at which they're being developed and tested and rolled out into the population it's alarming, but at the same time it's truly encouraging how fast this has gone. And this, however, could play into the hands of the anti-vaccine people. They make a lot of noise, but we must remember they're also in the minority. They have no scientific basis for many of their claims, so we must follow the scientific evidence, and the evidence points to these vaccines actually being quite good. And we do need something. I think everyone would agree. The pandemic in Europe currently is causing a death every 17 seconds, which is an absolutely horrifying figure. Finally, I'd like to stop here and just put this idea out that it might not be quite so bad. This was a nice article in the Times from last month from Ed Conway, and in it he stated that anti-vaccination messages are dwarfed in volume by pro-vaccination ones, and that the volume of anti-vaccination messages has actually decreased in the last 5 or 6 years. And further, he states inside, and I quote him, that can it be that those clever folks calling people conspiracy theorists on Twitter have been propagating their very own conspiracy theory? The evidence certainly suggests that's the case. And when there is a COVID-19 vaccine, then provided the public health authorities endorse it, and we're going through that process right now, the chances are that the vast majority of people will do what they've been doing for some time and take the vaccine. So it'd be a good time to have a poll if you would take a vaccine for COVID-19 or not. But I think with that, I'll stop now. I'm going to pass on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Matt Reeves from UCL. He's at the Institute of Immunity and Transplantation, Royal Free Hospital, where he's an associate professor, and he's an expert in cytomegalovirus and vaccine development.
Thank you. There was a couple of comments in the chat, Gary. Do you want to leave that?
Oh, yeah, we can take a look at those.
Well, I think whether you want to leave them to the end after Jonathan's talked, or because they're about uptake and ideas. I don't know. It's up to you, really.
I think let's go through and we'll answer them at the end. How does that sound to everyone?
It's fine with me.
Give me a chance to read them while the rest of the talk is going on.
So if I share my screen, yep, got a thumbs up. Good.
Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Can you see my screen, Gary? Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'll just get a pointer on so you can see a little hand floating around. Great. Okay. Thank you, Gary. So so I'm Matthew Reeves. I'm from the Institute of Immunity and Transplantation. This lovely drawing here is the building that will be actually built in March 2021. So this is the new research laboratories based at the Royal Free, and it's interesting that you mentioned Andrew Wakefield. I guess Andrew Wakefield is the Royal Free's dirty secret. He was actually at the Royal Free at the time of his measles announcement and MMR vaccination and autism. So the Royal Free likes to keep that one quiet. And so hopefully I'm not going to be a new Andrew Wakefield in the vaccine field. And so as Gary said, my interest is actually in cytomegalovirus, and I'm interested in the biology of that virus. And so I've sort of come round to start working on vaccines, and particularly a vaccine against my virus. But I'm not going to talk about CMV today as much as I'd love to. I'm just going to talk about, in general terms, about what we think about when we think about designing a vaccine as we go forward. And so really, what do you need when you think about a vaccine? We need a target, and of course we need a pathogen, and really what we need is the driver is, of course, is the disease, and the worse the disease and bigger the driver for the vaccine against that pathogen. The other thing you need, of course, is a functional immune system, and that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to educate the immune system to be able to control that pathogen. Of course, you need a strategy. So how are you going to build your vaccine? What will your vaccine look like? And again, Gary has touched on some of these aspects in his talk, and I'll talk about them in a bit more detail. And finally, what we've realized, of course, is you need a lot of cash. And if you want to do this quickly, and this is really why the SARS-CoV-2 has really driven at the rate it has, the money has been thrown at it, and we really have never really seen that level of financial incentive and financial drive to get to a vaccine as we have seen recently with the SARS-CoV-2. So money is the issue, because of course what we normally see is vaccines take a long time, and that's partly because we have to go through a very stepwise process, spending our money very carefully. What we've seen with the SARS-CoV-2 is, of course, we've tried to do everything at once, and that's part of the reason why we've been able to get there quicker. But we can't do that all the time. And so if we think about the pathogen, we're not short of these, and that's the worrying thing, really. We've got to think about, and many of these are what we call zoonoses. These are infections that are coming from animals, and around about 60% of emerging diseases are from animals. And of course, we have close contact with animals, a lot of animal husbandry, and so we're seeing this more and more. And quite famous zoonoses are HIV, which came from the chimpanzees. We know about Ebola, which are from bats, and of course we've heard about swine flu and avian flu, which is some of the influenza viruses that we're infected with. But there's an interesting quote here from a publication in 2007, which was really written in the post-SARS-1 outbreak from 2003. And I'll read it to you. It's that the recent discovery of a very similar virus in horseshoe bats, bat SARS-CoV, suggested that SARS can return if conditions are fit for the introduction, mutation, amplification, and transmission of this dangerous virus. The presence of a large reservoir of COVID-like viruses in horseshoe bats, together with the culture of eating exotic mammals in southern China, is a time bomb. And of course, are we there now in 2019, as we know about the situation we're in? So we were sort of had an idea that zoonosis can occur. We know this. The World Health Organization is constantly surveilling the populations for this, and so we had an idea that this was going to happen. We just didn't know what that virus was going to look like. So we're not short of pathogens, but fortunately we actually do have a pretty good way to defend ourselves against a lot of these pathogens, and of course that is our immune system. So I very briefly want to provide an immunology 101. So this is really a non-immunologist telling you a very simple version of the immune system. I think it's good to keep things simple, and essentially we talk about the 3 R's of immunity. And so the immune system relies on recognition, relies on response, and relies on regulation. So the recognition, of course, is the recognition either of the pathogen itself or the recognition of a pathogen which has infected the cell, so a cell which is infected with that virus. And so the immune system can recognize both those things. It can recognize the actual microbe, but also a cell that's been infected by that microbe. It's not enough to recognize it, it's got to respond. And of course it does respond, and I'll come on to discuss in more detail. It responds in different ways. Through antibodies, we hear a lot about antibodies in the news at the moment, and how we assess vaccines and how good the antibody response is. But also, as Gary alluded to in his talk, we're also very interested, of course, in T-cell responses, these cells that go around the body hunting for infected cells and destroying them. But we've got to be careful. We don't want too much of a good, we can have too much of a good thing, and we don't want too much of an immune response. It's got to be regulated. We don't want the immune system to run out of control, because as we know from the SARS-CoV-2 infection, actually a lot of pathogenesis is thought to come from a hyperactivation of aspects of the immune response. We have to be careful. Actually, overactivation of the immune response is just as dangerous as underactivation in many cases. And so when we think about vaccination, we really think about adaptive immune responses, and this is what I've talked about before, the immune response that learns from previous exposures and becomes specific for the pathogen that you're interested in. And our adaptive immune response essentially composes of B cells, which make our antibodies, and these T cells, which go around and find virally infected cells or bacterially infected cells. And essentially what they do is they both seek and destroy. And so antibodies classically find the microbe and neutralize it through blocking its ability to infect or to get into cells to replicate, particularly in the case of viruses, or they can recruit complement and cause their lysis. But essentially, they indeed neutralize the microbe directly. And I don't want to go into details about the nuances of antibodies and how they can work in different ways. Just having in mind that's really the classic way that we think of antibodies working, to find the microbe and neutralize it. In contrast, it's the T cells, they don't find the microbe. What they do is they find the cell that the microbe is in and destroy that cell. So it's all great, and this system works really well, and this is what protects us throughout our life. But unfortunately, this whole response takes time, and that's where the problem comes in. And so if we look at what the immune response looks like, if we start at time 0 and we've got the entry of the microorganism, and that microorganism will infect us, and initially it may well not even trigger an adaptive immune response. But what happens is the microorganism will replicate, and as it replicates, it reaches a threshold level of antigen. So there's a certain amount of antigen in the system to trigger an immune response. We hear about these people who are asymptomatically infected. Do they actually trigger a good immune response when they're asymptomatically infected? And really what they're talking about is how much pathogen do they have in the system. Once the pathogen reaches a threshold, you really get the induction of that adaptive immune response. The T cells and the B cells are switched on, and they come into the system to try and control infection. All the time, of course, the pathogen is replicating, and it's making more and more copies. So the level of the microorganism is increasing, whilst the immune system is trying to generate the response it needs to control that pathogen. If the immune system is successful and finds the control session, so it finds the control measures, it will then increase in number and get control of the pathogen, and we see that the pathogen load decreases, and we see that ultimately the pathogen, if the immune system wins, the pathogen is cleared. The important thing is that this event is not forgotten about the immune system. We get immunological memory. We remember that prior exposure, and the immune system knows about that. And why is that so important? Well, that is important because actually what it gives us is basically a bigger, better, and faster response to the pathogen in the memory response. So here we have the initial exposure, primary immune response. This is the antibody response. We see a good antibody response. The antibody levels will wane as the infection is cleared. If we then re-challenge with the same pathogen, the immune response will come back. It will come back bigger, more antibodies, probably better antibodies because they've been selected now against the pathogen and affinity matured. And it's also faster, so the time to get that response is quicker. And so the question we've always asked ourselves is, how do we get to this point without risking infection? And of course, what we have to do is we have to educate the immune system. And that's what vaccination essentially is. It's the education of the immune system to get it to this point without any prior exposure to the pathogen. And so if we think about what vaccination is, it's almost like a university education for the immune system. And what it's really, the quality of that education becomes dependent on three things. It's the content, how that content is delivered, and then who's delivering the content. And that's true of vaccination as well. It's not just a case of introducing the pathogen. We've got to introduce the pathogen or parts of the pathogen in the right way. The vaccine has to look good, essentially, to the immune system to get the right response. And so again, Gary has touched on this a little bit in his talk. But the question is, how do we educate the immune system? And we have three different ways. We have attenuated viruses, and I'll come on again talk about these in more detail. So essentially, these are versions of the virus which look like the virus, replicate like the virus, but they're not as pathogenic as the virus that they're mimicking. And so essentially, you're introducing something that looks very much like the thing that you want to vaccinate against. Inactivated viruses, so these are the wild type virus, but they are inactivated with chemicals, and they are introduced, so they can't replicate, but they of course will look again like the wild type virus, and they will present antigens to the immune system, which the immune system can recognize and respond to. And finally, there's bits of the virus. So these are the subunit vaccines that Gary talked about. So rather than present the whole virus, what we do is we identify bits of the virus that we think are really important and also really immunogenic. So bits that the virus needs and the bits that the immune system can make a response to. And so with the coronavirus, you've heard a lot about people talking about spike protein, because the spike protein is the protein that the virus uses to get into cells. And so it makes a really good antibody target, because if antibody can target that region, it helps the antibodies identify the pathogen, but more importantly, it can stop that pathogen from being able to infect the cells. And so we use bits of the virus that are very representative of that pathogen. And so essentially, that subunit vaccine strategy has really been expanded into three different strategies in itself. And so just to reiterate, what we have is we have inactivated viruses, which are really basically the wild type virus without the capacity to replicate. We have live attenuated viruses, which are essentially like the wild type virus, but they've been replicated to a point where a lot of their pathogenesis and virulence has been lost. So they look like the virus, but they're not as panic as the real virus. Or subunit vaccines. And so here we've got the SARS example. So you could just deliver the spike protein by itself, or you can deliver the spike protein in a viral vector. So you use another virus to present the viral protein that you're interested in, or we use the DNA and RNA to deliver the spike protein. And all these approaches, used in the right way, will develop an immune response. And so we've got all these different strategies for making a vaccine. So which vaccine platform is best? Well, if we look at them, live attenuated virus, which is really one of the classic strategies, which was used historically, particularly in polio, has been used in measles. And the idea, of course, is this is a replicating virus. And so by being a replicating virus, and you get higher levels of the pathogen, you get a better immune response. The immune response responds to antigens, and the more antigens you can give it, the better the response you're going to get. More importantly, the live attenuated virus looks a lot like the real thing. So you're not making an immune response that's going to be useless. It's going to be an immune response that does recognize the pathogen. The problems with a live attenuated virus is that it is an active virus. So whilst in a healthy person, it's unlikely to cause disease, it can be dangerous in immune weakened people. So a number of people are immune compromised. They may have got immunodeficiencies. They may be AIDS patients, and of course got acquired immunodeficiency. And if the virus gets into those individuals with a very weakened immune system, even though it's been weakened, it can still replicate and potentially cause disease. That's always the caveat with live attenuated viruses. And so inactivated viruses become really attractive because, again, they look like the real thing, and they can be used in immune weakened individuals because they won't replicate and cause disease. The problem is there is no replication. So often you might need to require boosters to get a good response, to get that pathogen antigen load above that threshold to really trigger the immune response. And so if we think about those three different types of subunit vaccines that we talked about, they're safe. They can't cause disease. It's very rare for a protein delivered by itself to cause disease. The problem with that is you need to know which bits of the virus are important. You need to understand the biology of the virus to really decide which bits of the virus to target, or at least you need to know which parts of the virus are immunogenic. The other thing you need is what we call an adjuvant. You may have heard about this when people have vaccines. Often with subunit vaccines, they're delivered with an adjuvant. And what an adjuvant really does is it substitutes for the fact that you're delivering the protein in the absence of a pathogen. And the adjuvant acts like an immune activator. So it tells the immune system there's a pathogenic protein in the system, generate an immune response. A caveat of that is it tends to be antibodies and not T cells. So you're only getting one arm of that immune response. So the solution to this issue of trying to get a more, a more complex immune response is to use vectors. And so we're seeing this, of course, with the Oxford vaccine for the SARS-CoV-2, where they're trying to deliver the spike protein in the context of the adenovirus vector from the chimpanzee. And so what you're doing is you're delivering the protein that you want to generate an immune response with another virus that you can use to trigger the immune response. And so what you get is a better activation of the immune response, and hopefully T cells are included in that response. You can be clever and direct the vaccine to the right place with engineering. The caveat again of that is, of course, you worry about potential immune responses to the vector, that viral vector, rather than the actual vaccine target. So what you've got to try and get is a vector that doesn't itself trigger immunity against itself, but activates the immune system to trigger good immunity against your vaccine target protein. And perhaps the most recent advance, I don't have any examples of vaccines where this has been licensed, is to use nucleic acids. So rather than make the protein, you actually just deliver the sequence of the viral protein in the form of messenger RNAs or DNA. And so the cells themselves make the protein and they present them to the immune system. They're quick to manufacture, very safe. There's no real threat from delivering DNA and RNA into an individual. But the key thing about them is that you don't need to have grown the virus. So something that Gary touched on, of course, is that if you want to make a live attenuated virus, you've got to isolate the virus in the first place to attenuate it. And it took 20, 30 years for them to get to the point where they could, for example, isolate polio. Sometimes you can't wait that long. But in this case, we don't need to isolate the virus. All we have to do is use sequencing technology. We can sequence the virus in patients, and we can find the sequence of the proteins that we're interested in, and we can just make the RNA. So we don't even need to have grown the virus. And this is why the nucleic acid vaccines were the fastest into clinical trials. It took 2 months for the Moderna vaccine to get into that trial. And it's because it doesn't rely on actually having the virus. You just need to know the sequence of the virus. So which vaccine platform is best? And essentially, there isn't one approach. And as you'll have seen from the SARS-CoV-2, there are different approaches being tried, and the answer is going to be empirical. We don't know until we put that vaccine into people. And so a normal vaccine timeline argues that you need several years of lab studies, then you need a phase 1 trial, and that really is the human safety. Is this vaccine going to cause any side effects? It's not whether it's protective or not. Is it just toxic? And that's really the phase 1 trial. Then you start a phase 2 trial, which is expanded safety, but built into that expanded safety, you can start to ask questions about protection. And so you start a phase 2, you're still looking at safety, but actually what you're now doing is doing what is essentially you're vaccinating individuals and you're asking the question, do they acquire the virus or are they infected? And part of this analysis is that you start to look at whether the vaccine induces a good response, and more importantly, can you find evidence of protection? So again, that comes down to the fact you need to know what immune response you're looking for. And finally, we have phase 3, which is where we go into thousands of people and we really show that the vaccine works. And so this normally takes years. So how have they managed being able to do this in 9 months in the case of SARS-CoV-2? And essentially what they've done is they've ran all these events in parallel. And so AstraZeneca were making the vaccine as we speak, as it was being made, as it was being investigated, by Oxford. And so they were already scaling up with the preparation to start the phase 3 before they even had the data from the phase 1. And so they've condensed it all. But the key thing to bear in mind is they're not compromising safety, because they're still extracting safety data from all these studies. And of course, they will be followed up over time. So essentially, and that has all been allowed by money. And so I want to finish by talking about polio vaccination. So we are approaching a phase where we may well be able to eradicate polio. And the story starts really from the 1950s, 1950s, and I think actually it really garnered support when FDR came to power, because FDR has very famously suffered from poliomyelitis, Roosevelt, I'm referring to. But it's the March of Dimes in the 50s where polio was a seasonal infection, and mothers and fathers were worried about letting their children to go out to play in the US. They was that worried about this infection. And essentially it led to 2 strategies. And there's the Sabin vaccine, which is an oral live attenuated vaccine, and the Salk vaccine, which was an inactivated vaccine, which is injected. And there's always been this argument, which vaccine is better? And so if we look at the 2 vaccines, Sabin and Salk, and we look at which was better, I think we have to think about really 2 things about polio. So polio replicates in the gut, and when it replicates in the gut, the virus, it doesn't really cause many symptoms of disease. It's when the virus moves into the nervous system that you see the disease. And so you've got 2 questions. You can either eradicate the virus by stopping replication in the gut and stopping transmission, or you can actually have a vaccine which stops the disease. And actually, as long as you can stop the transmission of the virus into the nervous system, the vaccine will be successful, even if it doesn't eradicate the disease from the population. And so the first virus that was made by Jonas Salk, which was the inactivated virus, and it was limited immunity. So, but importantly, it stopped infection of the nervous system. So it stopped the disease, and that was what was critical for the success of that vaccine. It clearly does not transmit, and because it's an inactivated virus, it doesn't replicate. But the issue came about was what was referred to as the Cutter incident, and Gary touched on this a little bit. And really, what happened is that there's a number of different pharmaceutical laboratories took the vaccine and scaled up production, and took Salk's inactivation protocol to inactivate the virus. The problem was that in the Cutter laboratories, they changed the protocol for inactivation. It led to improper inactivation of the virus, and it led to poliomyelitis in vaccinated people, which was actually vaccine-derived poliomyelitis. And so that really was it didn't stop the vaccination program with IPV, but it really it jolted the system. Hold on a minute, you're vaccinating people to protect them, yet you're giving them the virus that's giving them disease. And I think Sabin and Salk didn't really like each other, and Sabin jumped on this, and he always argued that live attenuated virus is better. It gives you better immunity because it gives you mucosal immunity, it gives you systemic immunity. The fact that the virus is replicating in the gut means you get better immunity. It was easier to administer and store, so his argument was this would be faster to herd immunity, that wonderful phrase that we heard about right at the start of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. We want to get to herd immunity, and the only real way to get to herd immunity is through vaccination. There was evidence that the attenuated virus could be transmitted, but more importantly, there was evidence that the vaccine can revert and cause poliomyelitis. And so actually the vaccine restores its neurovirulence. It's a very rare event, but it does happen. It's always worth bearing that in mind. The key thing to say is that oral polio vaccine has really been taken over and being used to eradicate polio. And it's always been the question, would the inactivated polio vaccine have achieved the same effect as the oral polio vaccine? And we're never going to know that answer. And so I'm going to finish and say that in an ideal world, when you're making your vaccine, you've identified the most important antigenic target, which will make a good immune response, and ideally that is essential for the function of the virus. And so that's why the spike protein has become really interesting in the SARS-CoV-2 vaccination field. This protein is the one that's required for entry of the virus, and it really is immunogenic. You have to have a way to measure immune responses against that protein to know that your vaccine isn't working. And that introduces really two important concepts that you might hear about as we move forward in the vaccine discussion in the SARS-CoV-2. And this is the correlates of protection and mechanistic correlates of protection. So very briefly, I'm going to tell you what the difference between them is. And so a correlate of protection is that if people make a response against which looks like this, they will be protected. It doesn't mean that that response is why they're protected, but that response is indicative of that they have made a response which is protective. Ultimately, what you want to identify, of course, is the mechanistic correlate of protection. What is the response that they are making which is actually responsible for the protection? Because if we know that, we can make the second generation vaccines and the third generation vaccines even better. And so hopefully we'll get to that stage with SARS-CoV-2 very quickly once we've gone through this first round of vaccinations. But I'm going to finish by saying it's all very well and good having a vaccine, but the real roadblock we have is that we've got to get mass production, and we've got to be able to administer the vaccine. And more importantly, we have to be able to get people to take up the vaccine. And so I'm going to finish there and hand over to Jonathan, who's going to tell us how that happens, or not, as the case may be.
Thank you very much, Matt. That's fascinating. Wonderful examples of how vaccines induce the right or wrong kind of immunity, and
well, I think
in many cases.
Well, we haven't even touched on wrong immunity, have we? But this is always the issue with dengue viruses, of course. There's wrong immunity, the vaccination against dengue viruses, and the fact the antibodies can make the virus more pathogenic.
Exactly. Yes.
That's a different story.
Antibody-dependent enhancement, and there's some that might happen for SARS-CoV-2 as well. Yeah, thanks very much. That's
okay.
Great.
No.
Yeah, so I'd like to introduce the third speaker for today, who's Dr. John Kennedy. He's from the Blizzard Institute, Queen Mary University of London. He's a senior lecturer in global public health. He's a sociologist, expert in vaccine hesitancy, as well as political and economic determinants of health. Welcome, John, and thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thanks for the invitation to speak at this forum, and thanks to both you and Matt for such fascinating talks. I learned a lot as well, so that's really great. As Gary said, my background's more in the social sciences, so I'm going to be kind of moving beyond what Matt said. And as Matt pointed out, there's been some remarkable successes with the development of vaccines, and this is really a triumph for medical science. The fact that there are vaccines that are so effective, that have been developed so quickly. But as I point out in this red text here on the screen, a COVID vaccine that's 95% effective in a clinical setting is only going to be that effective in the real world if everybody takes it. And so the developments in the last few weeks have really given us a reason to be optimistic, and I think we've seen that in kind of a lot of our own feelings and emotions about what's been going on and what the future is going to involve, but also things like stock markets. There's been a really positive reaction, but there's also some reasons to be pessimistic. And just looking at survey data, I've got a few kind of stylized facts here. There's been various surveys looking at people's attitudes to possible vaccines that are developed for COVID. So this was done before the announcement, but you see that there's a significant number of people both in the US and the UK who say they are unlikely to take COVID vaccines. And when we bear in mind all the stuff that Gary said earlier, which I totally agree with, about vaccines being really some of the most remarkable developments of kind of science and human civilization, really. This raises a question as to why people are not don't trust them, why people don't want to take them. And obviously this is an issue with COVID vaccines, and there's some concerns that they've been developed very, very quickly, and this might mean that some corners have been cut. And Matt dealt with how quick the process was and how brilliantly scientists have done to really kind of expedite the process because of the kind of really pressing nature of the pandemic. But we can also see that vaccine hesitancy has been a big problem for much longer. So if we look at 2019, before the outbreak, this was a report that was published in the summer of 2019 by the Wellcome Trust, and they did various surveys in various countries, and the country with the lowest vaccine confidence was France, where a third of the population believed that vaccines were unsafe, that vaccines had dangerous side effects. So they believed kind of misinformation about vaccines. Let's think about what vaccine hesitancy is, or how to conceptualize attitudes towards vaccines for a minute. I think it's useful to think about it as a spectrum. So on one far end, you have people who are really kind of set in their ways and believe that vaccines are dangerous or ineffective, and refuse to have all sorts of vaccines for them and their family. At the other end, you have the kind of ardent pro-vacciners. But in the middle, you have people that we could call them fence sitters or persuadables, people who kind of have a tendency either way, but are open to information and open to persuading with regards to vaccinating themselves or people in their family. And I think I told Gary and Matt when we had a chat about this last week, but my partner gave birth about 11 weeks ago. So a couple of weeks ago, we had to take our baby for her first vaccines. And you know, I really count myself in the green part of this spectrum, a fixed pro-vacciner. But even for me, it was quite an experience going from the academic world, where we talk about the effectiveness of vaccines, where we cite statistics about how effective they are, and the benefits of vaccines set against the risks, and then being in a kind of nurse's clinic, kind of having my baby jabbed, and the kind of way that messes with your emotions. So I think often in academia, often in public health, people who are vaccine hesitant are written off as being ignorant or being troublemakers. But I think it's also important to really kind of have some empathy and some humility, and to understand where they are coming from, even if we don't agree with them, because people's perception of risk is very different when they're faced with the issue of whether to actually take some proactive step to vaccinate their child. It's kind of different to just thinking about the risks at home when you're looking at statistics. So when we're thinking about what is driving vaccine hesitancy, I think it's important to say that it's a really complex and context-specific phenomenon. It varies across time, place, and even between different vaccines. And as I mentioned earlier, COVID seems to be subject to heightened suspicion because it's been developed so quickly, and I guess because there's so much money to be made from it by pharmaceutical companies, and this really kind of adds fuel to the fire of anti-vaxxers who believe that vaccines are, as Gary talked about, kind of part of a big conspiracy, often to make money for so-called big pharma, or even worse things, as we saw in the first talk. But what I'm going to discuss is a hypothesis that I think there's some evidence for, and I think makes a certain amount of sense to link the development of vaccine hesitancy, or the rise of vaccine hesitancy in certainly high-income countries, with the rise of populism in the political arena. So let's see what we have next. And I think to think about this, we have to kind of again go back to this point made by Gary that vaccines are really one of the great inventions of human civilization, if there is such thing. They've saved hundreds of millions of lives, maybe even billions of lives over the last few decades, really a remarkable invention that have kind of got rid or vastly reduced deadly and devastating infectious diseases. So when we're thinking why are people against vaccines, I think it fits in with a broader question of why do people, like, people's views on kind of the status quo and the whole kind of political and social system that we live in. So we can't just view attitudes towards vaccines in isolation. We have to see them as part of a kind of people's worldview, which is often informed by their experience of the world. So part of my research has looked at the link between vaccine confidence and populism and support for populist political parties in particular. And a paper I wrote a year ago, in the European Journal of Public Health, just showed with national level data how clear the association is between attitudes towards vaccines and voting patterns for populist parties in elections. And we see that countries with high levels of votes for populist parties also have really high levels of vaccine hesitancy, really low levels of vaccine confidence. You can also see this with individual level data. So I helped The Guardian and YouGov analyze some data a year ago or so as well. And we saw that in this country, for example, people that voted for so-called mainstream parties like Labour or the Conservatives, about 10% of those believed kind of anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. But when we looked at people that voted for populist parties at the time, that was UKIP in the UK, the rate rose to about one third. And we see this pattern throughout other high income countries, largely speaking. And also, as we see with this tweet here, even Donald Trump has spread misinformation a la Andrew Wakefield about vaccines. So I guess there's an interesting question of why this is. Why is there such a strong association between political populism and attitudes towards vaccines? And I think to understand that, we have to understand what populism is. And populism it's kind of anti-establishment sentiment, and it's a suspicion and a distrust and an anger towards elites and towards experts, and so in the political environment we see that this feeling manifests itself as voting for parties that are outside the typical center-left, center-right mainstream that has dominated politics in Western Europe and North America and other high-income countries for the last kind of 50 years or so. But in public health, this manifests itself in a different way. It manifests itself as kind of suspicion towards doctors, towards pharmaceutical companies, and towards public health or authorities. And so you can see that you can also kind of think about why people vote for populist parties, and often it's counterproductive for people to vote for populist parties. I think maybe in this country, a lot of the people that vote for Brexit will be those that also suffer economically. There's studies that suggest this, but support for populist parties seems to be the result of people feeling like they've been let down by the political and economic system, people feeling like they're disenfranchised by established political parties, people feeling that they've been marginalized by globalization and by what's happened in the economy, certainly since the financial crisis. And so even though I certainly wouldn't agree it was best for them to vote for populist parties, and a lot of their ideas are really kind of upsetting to me, I do feel that we need to kind of understand why they vote the way they do. So let's go on to this slide, and let's kind of think a bit about the role of social media, because we often talk of anti-vaccine sentiment as a new thing, and anti-vaccine sentiment as something that is really kind of facilitated by social media and the internet. I can't see your faces, but I imagine if you're students, a lot of you kind of have grown up with the internet and you're digital natives. But for me, and I guess for Gary and Matt as well, we grew up in a time before the internet, and it really has, over the last 20 years, changed the way we access information and changed the way that we communicate with one another. And this has had an impact on how people access information about vaccines. And there's been various studies that have shown, for example, that half of parents with children under 5 have viewed anti-vaccine material on social media, which shows that people are kind of are being peppered with this information. Also, recently there was a paper that showed that it was kind of I guess it was mimicking a randomized control trial and trying to see how people reacted to vaccine misinformation and how that changed their attitudes towards vaccines. And it was run by people at UCL from the Vaccine Confidence Project. So that's kind of run by Heidi Larson, who's a real shining light in the kind of in the field of studying anti-vaccine and vaccine hesitancy and these things. And this showed that when people were exposed to misinformation, they were much less likely to vaccinate themselves and people that they were responsible for. So supposedly their willingness to vaccinate themselves dropped by over 6%, and their willingness to vaccinate people that they care for dropped by almost 10%. So this shows that this vaccine misinformation does have a impact on people's willingness to vaccinate. And I think it's also really interesting to think who's producing all this information and why. And obviously there are some zealots that believe this and pump out information, but a paper published in the American Journal of Public Health a couple of years ago showed that the Twitter bots and trolls that are spreading misinformation about vaccines are often Russian, and they're the same Twitter trolls and bots that spread misinformation about Hillary Clinton in the 2016 US presidential election. So it seems to be the case that foreign powers have cottoned on to the fact that they can weaponize communication about vaccines and use it to spread social discord in our societies. So I think maybe that kind of puts a different light on how we view misinformation about vaccines, because often we can think about this just being a public debate and people having a right to say what they want. But when there's people that are spreading this misinformation for nefarious means, and when we know that this has an effect on public health, this is really worrying. There's also another study published recently showed that misinformation about health in general tends to be believed by people with lower numerical reasoning ability. And so this also kind of adds to the story that it's people who perhaps can't understand the pros and cons of vaccines who are vulnerable to misinformation. It makes sense, but also it kind of adds to the argument that maybe a just and decent society should be protecting people who are vulnerable to this, let alone kind of giving them a better education, so they actually have the capacity to really weigh up the benefits for themselves and the risks. Despite all this emphasis on social media and the fact that that kind of this has changed the way we access information and communicate, I think it's important to say, and certainly Gary kind of touched on this, that vaccine hesitancy or even kind of conspiracy theories about responses to public health crises is not a new thing. And so this picture here comes from the Black Death, which affected Europe in the middle of the 1300s. And even then, you had all sorts of misinformation about what was causing the disease. So certainly, probably the most tragic, horrific example is rumors, conspiracy theories that Jewish communities in Europe were responsible for this because they were poisoning wells. The Black Death killed between half and a third of the population of Europe at the time, and so these rumors resulted in attacks, pogroms against Jewish communities. So really, really tragic. And then if we look throughout history, there's other examples as well of this. When cholera first arrived in Europe in the 1830s, people didn't believe it was a new disease. They thought it was a conspiracy by the rich to kill the poor. And in this country, which had just gone through the Burke and Hare kind of case, where they were convicted of killing people in order to sell their bodies to doctors in Edinburgh Medical School to be used for anatomy lessons, people actually kind of got very angry with doctors, and they thought they were all part of this conspiracy, and so doctors were attacked. And as Gary said, there was the Anti-Vaccine League in the second half of the 19th century. But I guess the big difference between now and then is that we have, generally as a population, a much better understanding of how diseases are transmitted and how they work, of pathogenesis. And we also now have vaccines, and we understand that they are a benefit. So whereas in the 1340s, people didn't understand how disease spread. So kind of poisoning wells was a plausible way to understand what was going on. Similarly, in the 1830s, there wasn't kind of generally high levels of education, and people didn't understand how cholera spread. It wasn't until, was it 1854, I think, that John Snow discovered that vaccine was a waterborne disease by looking what was going on in Soho and discovering that there was one water pump in Broad Street that was responsible for a cholera outbreak. So people could be excused for their lack of understanding then, because there was a general lack of understanding. But now the world has moved on. So the fact that anti-vaccine attitudes are still really important, that people still believe these conspiracy theories about kind of diseases and vaccines tells us that there seems to be some kind of broader rejection of science and of the kind of narrative of scientific process, a kind of turning against the Enlightenment in many respects. So I'm going to start wrapping up now, and just to kind of throw a few questions out there. I'm not going to give you the answers, but just things to think about. Whether vaccinations should be mandatory, whether vaccine misinformation should be banned, and I think this kind of really gets to some of the most fundamental questions in political philosophy about the right of the state to intervene in the private lives of the individuals, and in to do with the right to speak freely, to have freedom of expression. And I think the reason why maybe the state should have a right to intervene in these issues is because of herd immunity, which we heard about earlier, and the fact that vaccines don't just work on an individual level, which Matt really interestingly described in kind of really lucid detail. But as he pointed out, they also work on a community level through herd immunity. And this can be great because if a certain number of people are vaccinated, then it means that there aren't enough bodies that are unvaccinated for there to be an outbreak. And so people who can't be vaccinated because either they're young babies, very young babies, neonates, or they are people with compromised immune systems, or children who are undergoing chemotherapy for cancer, for example. These people can't have vaccines, so they are protected by herd immunity. And so there is an argument to say that the state should step in to protect the most vulnerable people in society. If we as a society believe that the science on vaccines is right, that the benefits far outweigh the risks. So let me see. Sorry, I was just struggling. So yeah, I think kind of just to summarize, in many ways, the issues that we have around vaccine hesitancy can be seen as a canary in the coal mine. We first saw it with measles, and measles is, I believe Matt might correct me, but the most infectious virus out there for humans, and much more infectious than COVID-19. And so the fact that in the last few years we've seen, thank you, Matt, that's great. The fact that in the last few years we've seen an increase in measles, despite the fact that we have the biomedical capacity to for people not to have measles, despite the fact that we have a safe, easily administered, reasonably cheap vaccine. This shows us that there's something deeply wrong in our society, either with regards to supplies of vaccines, kind of the state and pharmaceutical companies and health systems aren't functioning well enough to roll out vaccine programs and make sure that people don't contract measles, or it's an issue with demand, the fact that vaccine confidence is low and people aren't vaccinating their children. But hopefully, as I've tried to discuss a bit, there seem to be broader political and social issues. Measles is just a canary in the coal mine for a bigger social and economic crisis or political crisis, and we're now seeing this with COVID as well. And we see how certain people that kind of tend to be poorer, from marginalized groups, are suffering much more from COVID, both the economic effects and the health effects. And so I think it's really interesting. Certainly the biomedical stuff is fascinating, but also when you start thinking about how this all interacts with politics and economics, for me it's equally fascinating. So I'm going to leave it there. And I think there were some questions, but I think we can all answer them, Gary, Matt, and me. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, John. That was wonderful. I particularly enjoyed the part on the weaponized health communications and the bots and the Russian trolls putting out information. I wonder if they're responsible for some of the information that's coming out on the Sputnik 5 vaccine the last period of time.
Well, someone sent me a meme, and it came out saying it was 92% effective a day after the Pfizer vaccine was supposed to be 90% effective, and it was just kind of mocking up a conversation between Putin and the scientists and saying, should we put 91? And Vladimir Putin says, no, that's too obvious. Let's go with 92. That's irrelevant, but it made me laugh.
It was just
who knows, right?
To be true, wasn't it? Hot on the heels of the first announcement to come out, we're just even better than you guys. Yeah, thanks very much, John. That's fascinating. There has been a few questions, and there's been questions even earlier on from Amanda and Klaus and Clara, who's now gone. Unfortunately, I've lost most of my chat because I had to log out and back in because my internet went bogus for a while there. But I think
so it means I can see it, Gary, if it helps. So
yeah, that's great.
So Amanda, So Amanda, right at the start, raised an important thing that presumably there are ill effects of vaccines, and even if very small, are much more preferable to the downsides of the disease. Is it these small effects that the anti-vaccination camp focus on, or is there another agenda? And I think that sort of links with Charlie's comment later on, that scientists need to stop grouping vaccine-hesitant people with anti-vaxxers, because I think that there are legitimate concerns, isn't there, with vaccines?
Absolutely, yes.
I think that's right. I think there are some people who will never have a vaccine, and they're the anti-vaxxers, and that it may be a minority. But I think there's a number of people who, with certain vaccines, maybe. I think there's a rotavirus vaccine. I think that's possibly why in France it's such vaccine hesitancy. I think it's quite common in France, the rotavirus vaccine. I think that has some side effects, and people.
Yeah, I know, because I gave my daughter had that a couple of weeks ago, and it gives you kind of 24 hours of diarrhea. It was pretty unpleasant.
It gives you a bit like a rotavirus infection in a way, isn't it? But it's
like a slightly attenuated.
No, but so I think it's true. I think it is. There is always that. There's always going to be that issue, isn't there? But then the side effects with aspirin. and
but perfectly safe.
Yeah. And it is weighing up that risk, isn't it? And I think what you're asking people to do is to stop thinking as an individual in some respects and think as the population. It's the greater good almost, isn't it? And that's quite hard when it's your child. And I think you touched on that, Jonathan.
Yeah, really. And it's interesting how this fits in with some of the reactions to COVID, right? And certainly in the US, the kind of attitudes towards wearing a mask and how that's become politicized. And I think that's pretty similar, this question of personal freedom versus the kind of social good, and yeah, it's kind of fascinating how attitudes towards vaccines often come down to this fundamental question of kind of what you believe in politically and what your assumptions are about kind of our own liberty and things. Yeah, no, it's fascinating.
Even the WHO couldn't figure out whether or not face masks were useful or not in the early days, and now it seems like they are. And we all know that President Trump refused to wear them in public, but then did, and then doesn't now that he's had the virus. Does anyone actually believe that he recovered from COVID, or was that a ploy to get more votes, or am I being too cynical?
No, I think he
I
think he had access to fantastic healthcare, right?
The
US, if you can afford it in the US, it's fantastic. He probably had antibodies and all sorts.
He did. He received monoclonal antibodies.
I think if you've got fantastic healthcare, you probably could deal with it, but not everyone has that. That's why vaccines are constant. Vaccines, particularly in poorer countries, become really powerful tools because they haven't got the healthcare infrastructure. So if we can protect them from the disease through a vaccine, that's always obviously the argument. That's what we're trying to do with polio at the moment. And I think
earlier on, Klaus made a comment too. I wonder if Klaus is still around. That it was religion interfering with God's work. I wrote down. I wonder what that was in reference to, Klaus.
I'm still around, and it was responding to Amanda's comment, because Amanda's comment was about rationally weighing up pros and cons, and I said, you know, she asked, is there another agenda? So I just said, yes, religion would have another agenda that is outside the weighing up of pros and cons, and saying that it was interfering with nature, and like Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, not allowing blood transfers, and there might be religious reasons refusing vaccination on principled grounds. So never mind the advantages or disadvantages in this life. Yeah, so that's all. It was just adding and saying that there might be an emotional side or an ideological side that has nothing to do with the advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, absolutely true, and that in fact could be an entirely its own topic for another forum, indeed, because it's such a massive issue.
It is, but I think Amanda makes a good point where she says religion doesn't explain the downturn in vaccine uptake in the West. I don't think you can explain that in Britain. It's not a religious decision, is it? Do you think? I don't think it is. I mean, I think it's
probably
for other reasons. No,
I would say probably not. And Clara, before she left, she made a comment about the COVID vaccines, and is there really enough regulation? And I think, Matt, you touched on that during your talk about the process of how the phase 1, 2, and 3 have been truncated down to very short period of time, but they're still collecting all of that safety data along the way. So
they are, and I think it's a numbers game, isn't it? It's a numbers game. This is always the criticism of the Wakefield study, and it was 3,000 kids, and now there's been 4 million or whatever it is, and I think that was always it's numbers, and so because they've basically condensed the phase 1, 2, and 3. They've done phase 1 first, and then 2 and 3 have been done together. They've basically got more numbers, and that's what they're relying on. They're getting the numbers faster, and they've only been able to do that because they've had the money. If I was running a vaccine trial, I'd have to go through it sequentially to keep getting the next pot of money. The difference is they said, well, we're just going to go with it. We're going to back you. You can start, and that's why they've been able to do this. So I think they're still getting the safety. Of course, we haven't got the years of safety. That's true, but and that will have to be collected, and these people have to be followed all the time. And these aren't going to be the only vaccines. I think there will be more vaccines. They'll have to second generation, third generation. They'll use the information from this to make the vaccines better. But I think the public health need is driving the need for a vaccine, and I think there are legitimate worries. You know, is this vaccine going to be truly safe? I think scientists can't say that, and we can't say that. But what we can say is that based on the data we have, it's better to have this vaccine and stop the spread of that disease, based on the data we have right now.
And it is the public are crying out for it, right? And the media is propagating this brilliant approach, and how fast it's been done and how effective the vaccines are. And it was in a way, it was nice to see that the Oxford vaccine only came out at 72% efficacy, which it was a bit suspicious. All the other ones were so effective. And
it's even better now, though, isn't it? Because they've realised it was a misdosing, wasn't it? And if they actually change the dose, it gets 90%.
Right. So a small dose followed by a large, or was it the other way around that seemed to work better in terms of efficacy? But there's some quite good questions on there. I think Svetlana has asked one here to Jonathan that he might be able to answer. I'm sure he can.
Just let me see.
Successful public health campaigns in the past which relied on social norms. Secondhand smoking is one example. do you think that shaming people for subjecting others to harm would work with anti-vaxxers?
That's a really good question, Svetlana. I mean, there's interesting research on health communication and specifically over vaccines, and it shows that if people are kind of already convinced of their views towards vaccines, so if people are already convinced anti-vaxxers, then it's really hard, even with hard facts and good evidence, to persuade them otherwise. And in fact, it can have a negative effect because it just kind of I guess it pushes them into a corner. And there's been kind of research that actually shows this. I guess the question is, and I think someone made this point in the chat box, of not conflating hard anti-vaxxers with vaccine hesitants. So to kind of maybe kind of put the hardcore anti-vaxxers, to bracket them, and kind of realize that perhaps we won't be able to deal with them through public health communication, and to focus on this big mass of people in the middle, people who are concerned for the safety of their children, people who have incomplete information about vaccines and their safety, people who've been exposed to misinformation and quite rightly want to know whether that's valid or not. And so yeah, I think shaming anti-vaxxers would be harmful. You know, in communication, there's various things you can do. You know, one is claims towards solidarity, suggestions that you act in a particular way through solidarity. That tends not to be that successful. Another is to provide people with information. That works a little bit, but by far the most effective form of communication is kind of things that have a shock value. So to really show the worst effects of an infectious disease on someone's child, and there are ethical issues with that in a way, but that seems to be the most effective way of changing people's point of views. And so I think that's why this issue is so interesting, because it kind of it raises all sorts of questions. And the analogy I often give when I'm teaching this is, if you think about the way in which NGOs try to raise money, you know, often they come out with what's flippantly called poverty porn, but just kind of really kind of heartrending videos and photographs that make you realize just how horrific people's experiences, and kind of more or less compel you to donate money. And you can draw a parallel with vaccines perhaps, but there are also problems with that. Ken had his hand up. Shall we go to?
Yes, of course, Ken.
And I'll show my face if I can. Oh, no, I can't. Anyway, thanks very much. It's been very enjoyable. Thanks, Gary, for organising this. I'm a colleague of Gary's, by the way, and thanks to Matthew and Jonathan as well. I'm just actually following up a comment by, let me go back to the comments. I think it was Charlie. Oh, no, sorry, Chris Rawlins, and he mentions the old diseases. I'm old. I'm 63. I wasn't vaccinated against measles. I had measles. I had chicken pox. I didn't know at the time. We didn't know at the time that measles was a bad deal. You know, all of us got measles. It was, you know, it just happened as part of your childhood, really. As was having mumps, and as was having chicken pox, and if you're really unlucky, you got mumps as well. But I never had mumps. But point I'm making is really to do with what Chris's comment about polio. And you're talking about how to shock people. Well, why don't you tell them the story of polio? People who got polio had to live in iron lungs for many, many weeks and months. And when I was a PhD student in the Department of Pharmacology, there was an academic, Alison Brading, who had polio, and she became disabled as a result of it. So she was living evidence of what happens if you don't have a vaccine against polio. And you know, that remains in my mind. So I think the shock value of that is really quite considerable, of the experience of polio before and after. And you see photographs of people, you know, in a whole sort of like a warehouse of people sitting in iron lungs, because they can't breathe properly. So I think that the shock value from that story may be worth something. But thanks very much. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Just a little anecdote there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with Ken. I mean, we're forgetting how bad some of these diseases are because we don't have them to anything like the same extent. And I think it's that is the thing that will make people see the good of vaccination in a way. It's seeing how bad the disease is, and it's sort of we're caught in that position where we can treat them very well. We've got the vaccines, and people are forgetting essentially. And
it's interesting because sorry, Matt, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Sorry, go on. I was just saying, people are in a very privileged position, aren't they? From a healthcare, we're in quite a privileged position that we can make this choice. I mean, if you'd have in the 50s, even after the Qatar incident, people were still taking the polio vaccine. It didn't stop. The IPV was still being used in the 50s and 60s because I think people partly trusted medical profession more, but also I think people realised they were living with polio, and they were prepared to take the risk. And they didn't want to get the virus. They were prepared to take the risk on the vaccine. And I think that was the difference.
Yeah, and you actually see that with statistics on attitudes towards vaccines. So when the Wellcome Trust released this big global monitor report in summer 2019, it showed that vaccine confidence was lowest in the richest countries, and the most kind of common explanation for that is the fact that those are the countries that have gone through the epidemiological transition, that are no longer in the age of disease and pestilence, and so people can afford to be complacent. Whereas if you grow up in in Pakistan or Afghanistan, where there's still endemic polio, you want to probably make sure that you take it, right? Whereas here it's not such an issue. And I guess kind of something that we'll see is how COVID changes that, because
absolutely
now we see the kind of the situation flipped on its head, right? Where kind of certainly the number of deaths per head of population are highest in some of the richest countries in the world, in the UK, the US, if we can trust the statistics. But it's interesting how that might change things.
Well, I think it's historically our healthcare systems have been capable of coping. So you almost got that safety net. If I do get the infection, our healthcare system probably can cope and treat you. Whereas, of course, if you're in a very poor country and the healthcare system isn't as good, if you get that infection, you're probably going to die. And that's the difference. Our healthcare system can save us. And I think we have that safety net, which may make sense. We don't need a vaccine. I've got a healthcare system.
It's a good point.
Trump did.
Doesn't it, Matt? So HIV is still on the increase. There's still new infections in the UK all the time. There's complacency because there's good medications and good healthcare, and you can live for 30 years with HIV. Whereas if you caught 30, 40 years ago, you were going to die.
Yeah.
Still no vaccine.
But the argument is, do we need a vaccine? You can live for longer in ART,
There's a good point here made by Charlie, again on the chat. How should scientists reset the conversation around vaccines with the public? Unless this happens, this will fail. The onus of changing the tone of the conversation is on scientists and public officials. It's not happening yet, and that's the biggest problem. The way in which scientists are dismissing legitimate concerns people have is disturbing and arrogant. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think the first thing to say is that scientists and doctors are in a pretty good position in this country because survey data shows that they're much more trusted than journalists and politicians. So I think and kind of company bosses, so pharmaceutical company bosses. So I think kind of it's people like us and doctors that have to kind of take the lead on this. But as Charlie pointed out, there needs to be humility. There needs to be an understanding of why people feel this way, why people are concerned about vaccine safety, and just as we need to try to educate people about the benefits of vaccines, we we have to also understand why they are concerned about the risks of them. And you know, I guess the problem with society at the moment is it's difficult to have these nuanced debates and to say that, you know, there are risks of vaccinating your child, but these are very much outweighed by the benefits for everybody. That's really hard to kind of communicate in a sensible way. So it seems like the debate gets simplified, right? And people either kind of say, yeah, vaccines are great, vaccines are safe, or vaccines are unsafe, rather than having a mature discussion.
Yeah, I guess, as Klaus has pointed in the chat there, look at messaging of historical campaigns with great results. Where have we been successful? But I think it comes back to the point, we've been successful where the disease has been rife. I think that's always been the driver, hasn't it? And so it's easy to get the message across if people are dying.
And also, if we look at some historical cases like smallpox in India, you know, there was kind of almost a military effort towards the end to kind of find the isolated cases, to track them down, and to and you know, that kind of that makes a lot of people in, you know, liberal countries squeamish, but that was really effective to have this kind of almost militarized immunization programs. I'm not suggesting that's something we should do, but it's something that was effective.
So a good comeback from Klaus there. People are dying now, and he's right. There are people who are dying now. So is it because it's who the people are dying? No, in the polio, it's children dying. And now most people. I'll get the infection. I'll be fine. It's the old people, right? I don't know. Is it something different going off there? People more protective over the children.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Which diseases get kind of prioritized, right? And of course, you know, if we think of the numbers of people that die every year from HIV/AIDS, TB, what else could we say? Kind of cholera and other kind of similar waterborne diseases, or malaria. These are kind of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people every year, but they're all kind of all people in low-income countries. And it seems like, you know, kind of if we think about Black Lives Matter, you know, kind of certainly it seems like when we come to infectious diseases, diseases matter more when they disrupt the economies and threaten people in high-income countries than they do when it's...
I think the point of solidarity there, you think of the vaccines that aren't taking them. So influenza vaccine, people don't vaccinate their children for that, because again, the influenza vaccine isn't ready for the children. Of course, we're doing it to generate herd immunity. For this, the argument will be a lot of it's to generate herd immunity to protect the vulnerable. Whereas, of course, with the polio vaccine, the smallpox vaccine, we're vaccinating you to protect you. And that's the difference, isn't it? It's how do you get from an individual to a society? I think that's what scientists have got to, and communicators have got to work out. How do we get that across? Get away from the individual to society. It's very hard to do if we say this infection is probably not going to kill you, but it'll kill someone else. But we want you to take the risk of a vaccine. So it is hard.
It is hard. And there's a perfectly good vaccine for chickenpox that's not routinely used in the UK. And Matt, I remember asking your old boss, Paul, about this, and I didn't really. He claimed that it wasn't used here because then they were worried about there be more cases of shingles developing in the future. And I, to be honest, I didn't really get the reason why there would be more cases.
Because the vaccine reactivates.
Right, the vaccine reactivates. Yeah. Well, there you go. It's a safety issue. Vaccines.
I'm make sure. I want to check that. I'm sure it's the vaccine. It's the vaccine that's reactivated. So they're getting infected with essentially attenuated virus. Yeah. You don't get the chickenpox, and the shingles you get is less severe because it's an attenuated virus. But the virus is an active virus.
Right.
It's a live attenuated, so you do get shingles. And, so I would say my children were not vaccinated for chickenpox. So I didn't vaccinate them. But they've had chickenpox.
You still develop shingles after natural infection. Is that worse than the variant you'd get after a vaccine?
the argument would be the natural infection would be worse. I think that's the argument. And what you're trying to do is, of course, again, is to protect. So that's partly protecting other people, isn't it? Because old people are at risk from children who have got chickenpox. Again, it's not the child that's at risk, is it? It's the older population.
So my daughter ended up in hospital with chickenpox. She was covered in the things. It was like all over her. It was really bad. And then the skin, they got infected, super infected with bacteria, and she ended up on antivirals intravenously for a couple of days from a vaccine preventable disease. And it's just a herpes virus, if you want to call it just a herpes virus. So. I wondered why it wasn't used more. I mean, you can buy the vaccine, presumably, if you want to yourself get it, but it's not offered free with the NHS. Anyway, taking up the floor. Is there any questions from anyone? You can raise your hand and ask, or did we miss anything in the chat?
I was just looking through. I mean, Amanda, who's now left, made a comment about one of the major legitimate concerns that scientists are human and humans make mistakes, and she cites thalidomide as the example, of course, which was a public health catastrophe. So thalidomide is actually still used, of course, to treat leprosy and to treat cancer. We just don't give it to pregnant women anymore, and that was the. But yeah, it's right, and I think. That is a legitimate mistake, because, of course, the thalidomide story only came out after years of follow-up, when doctors started to realise, well, hold on a minute, where's all these women we're prescribing with thalidomide having deformed children? And that is a legitimate concern. We might not know the effects of a vaccine until 10, 15 years down the line.
And there are legitimate reasons.
Carry on, John.
There are legitimate reasons not to trust pharmaceutical companies and not to trust the state, right? If we look at what's happened with Purdue Pharma and opioids over the last 10, 20 years, and the way in which research seems to have been kind of, or the way in which they kind of seem to have kind of suppressed research that showed the harmful effects of that. And this resulted in, like tens of thousands of needless deaths with people addicted to opioids. It ruined people's lives. Or if we look at kind of the impact that austerity in this country has had on disabled people, and the way that that's destroyed people's lives, it kind of and we've also had research in public health linking austerity to stalling life expectancy, and this kind of seems to indicate that the state doesn't really care about people's health. And so, you can understand why people are skeptical, why people don't trust pharmaceutical companies or the state when they say, this is in your best interest to do it, because they've experienced in many cases the kind of opposite from those different organizations.
So anyone else like to ask questions? You can raise your hand or use your microphone to ask questions. I'm just checking the chat if we've missed anything else. Right at the bottom of 1 to 10, how confident are you with the ability of the global and local supply chains to handle delivery of the vaccine? 10 being very confident. Interesting.
Well, I think again, it comes back to which vaccine you're talking about as well. I think the excitement about the Oxford vaccine is that should be easy to distribute, because the handling and storage of that vaccine is much easier than the RNA vaccine, and so that's why we're excited about the Oxford vaccine. I think the Oxford vaccine is the one that's going to be the one that will go around the world. I think that's the one that will ultimately become the one. It's a bit like the polio story, wasn't it? It was the Sabin one. Was the one that works because it was easy to store, to make, and to administer. And he gave that to the World Health Organization. He gave all 3 strains of his live attenuated vaccines to the World Health Organization to use. So how confident I am? I'm going to go for an 8. I'm pretty confident, actually. I think we can do it.
I agree. There's not so many people traveling, and those airliners need to get moving, don't they? The pilots need the work.
Yeah, and the cost of it not working is so high that
I think it will happen. Yeah.
Yeah, it has to happen.
I mean, it comes down to the scale up, right? I mean, is it AstraZeneca who's doing the scale up with the Oxford? Is it AstraZeneca? How quickly they can do that? It's the scale up, and if they can do it on local sites, that's even better.
Yeah, they've got labs all around the world, right?
Yeah. And they, I think they are doing it at cost, aren't they? I think, to be fair, that's right.
Yeah, for developing countries. Yes.
Yeah.
They'll make a profit from the governments that can afford it.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's the way it should be.
Yeah. But it seems to be Europe and the United States that kind of need it at the moment.
Well, yeah, true. Well, I do think I mean, for talking a bit of politics, I mean, I think the fact that the Oxford vaccine came through, and of course we backed that as a government, and we've bought lots of that that vaccine. That's, I mean, in a way, that's a godsend for Boris Johnson's government, because we were going to have real issues because we had no deals to get the other vaccines. If the Oxford vaccine hadn't come through, the UK government was in a bit of a pickle. The fact that we've got so many of these on back order is actually probably, in a way, will help them a bit and save that government a little bit, especially with Brexit happening.
Will 73% efficacy be enough, Matt? Will that protect enough people?
I think with the R number, I mean, I think the idea is it's around about 70% you would need. I think that should give you the herd immunity.
How long?
We're not talking measles here.
Because these genetic vaccines haven't been around for long in people. So, I mean, let's talk about the Oxford one for a minute. They tried that for MERS, didn't they? And also for Ebola. But it was not licensed for those. Do you know the reason why? And if there are still studies showing there's immunity in those people that received it or not?
I don't know, to be honest.
Something unique to the spike that it doesn't promote a stronger, durable immunity.
I mean, I think this could be a seasonal vaccination. I mean, we may need it more than once, right? But I think by the time we need it again, hopefully AstraZeneca will have got the production up.
Right. Yeah.
And I think what it will require is other pharmaceutical companies, biotechs, to get involved and help with the production. A bit like what happened with the polio in the 50s. As long as you don't get a cutter lab incident. But we're not inactivating, so we're all right.
Yeah. It should be safe, shouldn't it? The chimpanzee bone vector.
Well, it's got to be. Well, I think they learned a lot of lessons from the polio situation, and the FDA and the EU and UK regulatory bodies have got far more stringent tests in place to make sure the vaccines are safe. What's the game plan?
Yeah, I mean, there's almost always these kind of events in vaccine trials, and there's been none really so far related to the actual vaccine. If we're talking about the Oxford vaccine, there was one that was publicized where someone had a bad reaction, but that was due to some other disease, I believe, or some other effects entirely. And the vaccine's been so far in tens of thousands of people, so it's very, very few. Statistically speaking, they will happen, yes. They will be amplified, these cases. Yeah, what do we do then?
Well, I think the issue might come is if we have to go into a seasonal vaccination situation. I think people will be up for the vaccine for the first time round because we're living in the middle of the infections. But actually, when we get infections down with the first round of vaccines, people might be more hesitant about another vaccination because there's no virus around. I don't need a vaccine. And that's where the problems might, especially if we start to see some adverse reactions. People will, I think the hesitancy will come even more on a second round, third round of vaccination if we have to go seasonal. And that's what we'd have to deal with.
And will we be quick enough to make these new variants of the vaccine? Let's say, for example, a new animal species gets infected, like the minks in Denmark, the virus mutates yet again, and recombines with another coronavirus, it comes back out and infects people, and it's totally different. So we need a new vaccine.
Well, I think the point that Chris made there, will the COVID vaccine help us against other emerging viral threats? And I think my view of vaccine development is moving away from individual pathogen develop a vaccine. It's more to create platforms to rapidly make vaccines against new targets. And I think that's where vaccinology has to go. You've almost got to have a platform in place, which as soon as a new target emerges. So, for example, as soon as SARS-2 emerged in China, a lot of people they switched over to making the vaccine.
Yeah.
And that was it. But they had the platform in place because the platform had been used in the Ebola trials in Oxford. It had been used, etc. So I think that's the key thing now, is actually having the platforms, and we can do everything much faster. And because if we can make sure the platforms are safe, the vectors or however the RNA delivery system is safe, it gives us more confidence then that the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 will give us better data from a safety point of view.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Matt. I think you made that really well in your talk about how the platform is there, and that the winners in this race almost at the moment are the ones that you can quickly generate just based on a sequence. And if you can plug that into your platform, your system, and away you go, you've got the doses there ready first, and it's great that they work. Any further questions from the audience, or John, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I'll just add to that point, as someone with a background in social sciences, and it's also important to think about the kind of social, economic, political conditions in which this vaccine has been allowed to emerge and kind of spread throughout the world, and to recognize that some countries have done much better at dealing with this than others. And so, obviously it's really important, and it's really fascinating to develop vaccines and to look at how vaccines work. But it's almost, it can be seen as a political, a social, an economic failure that we've got to the point where we've allowed this this emerging or emerged virus to cause so much chaos. And we should also look back and see what could have been done differently when around Christmas time last year we knew there was an emerging threat, and we still didn't manage to stop it. So yeah, certainly it's important with the vaccine things, but it's also important to learn lessons about global health governance and things like that.
Well, I think that spoke to a little bit. This was the criticism was made of our perceived exceptionalism, that it's a problem in China, this virus, but we'll be all right, okay, because we're the UK, we're the Western world, we'll be fine. And I think they've got far more experience with respiratory virus infections. They know the threat. They're dealing with them a lot more than we are in Southeast Asia. They'll instantly start wearing masks. They have, I think society, they lock down much quicker. And maybe that was the problem. Actually, we just didn't jump on this. As you say, we didn't jump on the virus fast enough. But hopefully the next time we will. and actually we might. It will give ourselves more time. I think partly we were tricked a little bit by SARS-1. Because SARS-1 was this big threat came out, and it never materialized, did it? And I think people thought, it's just been another SARS-1.
Yeah, we
got caught out
before symptoms would appear, and only then was it transmitting to the next host. Yeah. Whereas this virus seems to have got it a bit more right in that it can replicate and transmit with no symptoms at all, and that spread it's
less pathogenic, it's less virulent, but it's causing more deaths. That's the oxymoron of this virus.
Yeah,
SARS-1. Because it's more transmissible. I always tell my students it's all about transmission. Yes, and that's what. And you go back to measles. Measles is the most transmissible virus. It's a fantastic virus for transmission. If you're a virus, I think it's got an R value of 18 or something like that. It's ridiculous.
It is indeed. Right, brilliant, guys. Thank you very much for Matt and John for your contributions today. It's been, I think, really good discussion, and thanks to everyone else that appeared and those who have disappeared as well. Thanks for listening. Thanks for contributing. I think we've reached the end of our time, and we've earned a well-earned drink or dinner, whatever you prefer right now.
A beer.
Yeah, I think something like that sounds excellent.
No, that was great. I enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that, and it's great. There's great interactions there. I thought it was really fun.
Thanks. It was fascinating.
A lot of things to think of.
Yeah, really interesting talks from you two, and good discussion from everyone. I hope, fingers crossed, that early next year we'll have a good vaccine that everyone takes.
Let's hope so.
All right, I'm going to shut down the recording and thank everyone again for coming, and take care and stay away from that virus.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Good. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.